everyone. Thank you for being here, and it's a pleasure to share a stage with Jennifer and Ben, and thank you to John and Teresa, too, for having me and the whole team. And thank you, Neil, for having faith in this book. I thought I'd start by saying, first of all, it's really nice to be back in Newcastle, a city that I know well and love dearly. I actually spent 12 years living in the UK, and it was a time that I really enjoyed, and I ended up moving to the US about 7 years ago in order to be with my partner. And it began what ended up being quite a fraught immigration process that took about close to 6 years to finish, really. And so I thought I'd start with that. It's called Welcome to America. Let's start again from the top. Nothing you told me sounds true. I've looked at your passport, and there are too many stamps. What kind of man calls himself cosmopolitan anyway? You're ruthless and dangerous. I've printed out your poems and essays, and I want an answer right now. What are you doing here? Love isn't a reason, and neither is wanderlust. Why would she want you? Can you make enough money? I like thrillers and mysteries and plots with a point. Look around you. We're filled to capacity. This country is too generous. See that old man in the wheelchair? He's been here for days, and you'll be here longer. Nobody reads anymore anyways. I'm late for lunch, as it is, and if it was up to me, I'd send you straight back. I then made the mistake of asking for, I love how poets cannibalize their own experiences, and so while I was being threatened with deportation, I did ask for pen and paper because I had an idea about a poem, and they didn't like hearing that, unsurprisingly, really, in retrospect. I'll talk a little bit more about the book in a second, but since this is the first time, it's actually the first time I'm reading from the book, so it's very exciting. It's also, we're still in the early stages of getting back together and being in settings like this, and I thought I'd read a poem that I think tries to plug into this emotion in the past few years that we've had. And it's called The Bond, and it's dedicated to my friend, the South African poet, Stacey Hardy. The Bond. The dry August air reeks of wood and ash, and the smoke plumes, leaving the rocky bowl of the St. Gabriel's, sink to kiss the lawn. The dogs bark themselves hoarse, their frightened black throats as charred as the wounded hillsides. No refuge for coyotes, raccoons, or the striped skunk as they scatter like sparks from a camper's hearth. What is power if not the ability to dislodge the living from their synchronous groove? After 6 months of death and disease, the rabbits stir from their nests in the crevices of rusty engines, and people finally begin to mourn. On Verdugo, a cardboard placard stapled to a half-stripped tree reads, "Goodbye, Emilio," or as the newspapers call them, John Doe, number 283. But nobody's heart's large enough to hold all the names of the fallen. On either side of the boulevard, a slew of recession-raptured businesses. To let, for lease, pray for us. And even the sign above the gun store, armed and dangerous, says, "We're through." Today, my distant friend, I've only got room for questions. What does endurance mean if it appears to be endless? What is grass if not gunpowder? What is this chain of encampments and shanties hugging the freeway, if not humanity's take on the Great Barrier Reef? Each person a polyp on the coral of concrete. I think of you in Cairo and your imprisoned comrades, another tinderbox awaiting the flintstone of hurt. It is late at night, so let every word draw blood. Everything is not going to be all right. All my life, an unbroken string of departures, a litany of leaving, but here and there, faint glimmers of meaningful connections, including with you, my sister from another mother, another father, another world. Perhaps we shall soon meet again, perhaps not. Perhaps the flowers stuffed into the beaked masks of plague doctors provided more comfort than safety. Perhaps not. But what gives us solace between our first lungful of air and the last handful of lime? The bond. Only the bond. So where to now, wanderer of the wastelands? I think it's probably worth saying that. There's this wonderful quote by Czesław Miłosz, a poet that I'd read before, but who I've really learned to read in a better way, I think love more in a deeper way, ever since I moved to California. There's this lovely quote that I keep clinging on to, which is, "I did not find California, it was given to me." And I very much feel the same. And High Desert, essentially, in some ways, a bit of an anti-Western. What it tries to do is talk about the complicated history of California, but also the Southwest. The poems are based in Los Angeles, Arizona, Utah, or the American Saudi Arabia, as I call it, New Mexico, Oklahoma. And one of the poems now I'd like to read to you was quite central to that project of telling these stories. That range from labor rights to racial oppression, is called Roadrunners. Roadrunners. In the pink light, halos of cloud form over the mountains. Lightning 2 valleys away. Then, not an hour later, the explosion of thunder. The roadrunners pecking for breadcrumbs on the porch have long since fled into the endless ocean of grass. Driving in every direction down licks of red road, I have lost myself in a militarized topography. Everything named after army units, generals, scouts, miners. The Dragoon Mountains, Cochise stronghold, defunct Gleason and Pierce, weird rusty ghost towns, the only non-derelict structure for miles, the local school. Its polished windows and well-kept lawn, a source of great local pride. No mountain monograms for these desiccated whistle stops. No giant Q or C or W in bright white paint to mark the township's still functional, kind of functional breathing. No carving for them into the planet's bark, and thus they are blessed to me like no other. Every successful city is a flimsy affair with civility. Its eternalness, like Paris or Rome, a slow march to desacralization. Make America great again. Buy real estate. Hail follows rain. Nearby, the township of Sunsites, once billed as the safest spot to survive the inevitable nuclear winter, actually topped Soviet Russia's list of high priority targets. Enter the orange duck candidate. A haboob sweeps across the valley of the Senile, and in a week, the mountains have switched from brown to purple to green. The desert is human endeavor's most fitting graveyard. The slow bleaching, the gradual eroding into sand, the heat stifling sound as it leaps into the air. It can't happen here, but it always does. By the way, that last line, it can't happen here, I put it in caps in the book because it's the title of a fantastic novel by Sinclair Lewis that kind of predicted the 2016 election. I'd recommend you all read it, even though it was published more than 80 years before that. The next poem I wanted to read to you is another central poem from the book that really tries to delve into the history of the Southwest. And this was a poem that I wrote after spending the summer in the deserts of southern Arizona. And I had gone there to take part in the 101st anniversary of the events that I'm going to describe to you now. And it's called At the Graves of Labor's Fallen. And it begins with a quote, a real one, from the New York Times, published in July 1917. Quote, "It is intolerable that these itinerants of anarchy should infest the great regions of the West. The best plots in the cemetery belong to cattle thieves, cutthroats, bushwhackers, or as any respectable boomtown would call them, our esteemed founding fathers. But by the northeastern corner of that acre of dust off the old Douglas Road stood the graves of the Wobblies, tall as cigarette stubs. Time had made most names illegible. But what little survived made it clear that half the world lay buried here in Bisbee. Mexicans, Greeks, Slavs, Italians. Some fell down mine shafts, others grew old, but all died poor. Some certainty, at least, in the otherwise unpredictable lives led by miners in copper country. Whoever said that America skipped its medieval stage? Nothing was left unscathed by that feudalism. Wandering holy men, ruthless barons, armed thugs on horseback, peasants' revolts, the imaginary but ever-effective specter of dark hordes at the gates. July 12, 1917, 1,200 Americans deported in a single morning. A posse, a roundup, and then a 12-hour train ride to Hermanas, New Mexico. All women and children keep off streets today, read the Bisbee Daily Review, but they were banished too. Blame public hysteria and spineless Woodrow Wilson. Blame General John Jay, buried them with pigs Pershing and his crusade against Pancho Villa. Consider also the Buffalo Soldiers, too black to die for their country in France, but not too black to shoot at Mexicans on the border. Consider, finally, that no court hears such cases except that of memory. Come sunset, I speed down the gulch to Gucci's and sing, work and pray, live on hay, you'll get pie in the sky when you die. That's a lie. I'll read the title poem of the book. It's called High Desert. Time to listen to my bones, to seek a stillness known only to deserts. Pause, traveler, and behold this empire of absences. The snowy salt beds of vanished lakes, the outlines of decommissioned railroads, the petroglyphs of people murdered long ago, and all around nearly limitless stretches of cottonwood, willow, and mesquite tufting out of the sand. All day, I drive along mummified freeways from Amboy to Zizix and zip past Cadiz, Baghdad, and Siberia in under an hour's time. The ghost towns of America's Main Street, an unbroken montage of smokestacks, silhouettes of sidewalks, the bordered remains of small businesses. There is no better backdrop for the mirage of permanent boom times than the desert, a landscape where, despite claims to the contrary, no town was too tough to die. Once genocide had cleared the country, and extractionist lust was unleashed on the West. The blunt simplicity of place names a shrine to the seeker's obsessions. Carbondale, Copperopolis, Oroville, Petrolia, Spartan mockeries of morals and models left behind and forgotten, towns where sheriffs robbed trains at gunpoint or smuggled liquor across the border only to blame it on Mexican bandits. Next to no sign now of the old tribes, the trappers, the pioneers, yet no shortage of jackrabbit meth labs, tin cans, rusted lawn chairs, gas stations, and fall 50s diners. Dead or alive, each one of them greets me with the same sign, the same 4 planks of wood, name, date of establishment, elevation, and population, the latter always in the single or double digits. Exhausted, I lie down on the sand and warm my feet by the embers of this final frontier, and consider how strange it is that it's here, where after decades of ruthlessness, I abandon all cravings for permanence. The book, I think because I was trying to deal with such a huge variety of topics, I realized that I didn't want to write all the poems in first person with the lyric eye, and so for the first time in my life, although it was a form that I always admired but never quite figured out how I could make it work for my own purposes, I produced a sequence of found poems, and it's called A People's History of the West, kind of riffing on Zinn there, and it takes you through the early beginnings of Spanish California, and it begins with the work of Pablo Tac, who is a Luiseño scholar who left behind one of the only records of his tribe. Originally, his people were from LA and St. Gabriel. It goes all the way to Richard Nixon, who many Californians like to forget was actually a Californian. But there's a poem that I wanted to read to you here, also because there's an interesting story behind it, but I'll just go ahead and read the poem first. George Patton, 1885 to 1945, U.S. General and pheasant hunter. And this is all in his words. I urinate in the wash basin and wash in the urinal because I have forgotten what they look like. The nearest railroad is 21 miles away. All officers and men will live in floored tents. I wish to God we would start killing somebody somewhere soon. My dear friend Caroline, I would be unpatriotic if I aided anyone in bringing comfort to our country's enemies, the Japanese in California. I have shot one or more jackrabbits each day that I've been here just to keep my hand in for Rommel. The Mojave is a wasteland, and there is room to burn. Sitting on a tank watching the show is fatuous. Killing wins wars. Who is as good as I am? I know of no one. I'm a hell of a guy. Those were his words. The reason these letters existed essentially when Patton was busy interning the Japanese in California, who of course had been there for a very, very long time, were frankly far more American than he ever was. His friend from high school, Caroline, who's mentioned in that poem, wrote to him and said, "Dear George, we went to high school with a lot of Japanese people. They're lovely. How could you possibly do this?" And this was his reply to Caroline. And I think I'll end with a bit of a longish poem that took me a while to finish up, and Neil was very kind to include it relatively at the last minute. And it's called Thule Fog, which is a lovely kind of word there. Thule, spelled T-U-L-E. And although probably most of you will know that San Francisco, north of California, is famously shrouded in fog, only the city itself, because everywhere else the sun shines and burns. But what is less known is that the Central Valley of California, which feeds most of that country, the wider country, is also dominated by this phenomenon called Thule Fog that is quite destructive and it's quite thick and happens at very specific times of year. And it's a coda that I wrote to the book in order to chart the progression away from the desert and towards the north of the state, where we now live. So it's Thule Fog, and it's for Zinzi. After 5 years of life in the desert, you drive north as the fog floats over the fields like a ghost or a frozen prayer. And rolling past Delano and Merced, you wonder, what does home mean to you now? Then the answer rises out of the cottony gloom. Home is a sleeping bag in a parking lot, a bedroll in a barn, a blanket laid down in a ditch, but never a right, never a certainty. The sun is lost, and everywhere the feeling that the party is over fills the air. The king tide of traffic recedes, and a voice on the radio is singing, "I'm vaccinated and I'm ready for love." Care team members are busy assisting other callers. Your call is important to us and will be attended to shortly. If happy countries exist, I've yet to see one. And 47 nations later, my idiot heart still races at the sweet sound of wheels on the tracks. But for today and tomorrow and 3 years of yesterdays, I stay put, wrapped in a fog as dense as pea soup. What is fog? Fog is water when it dreams of granite, when it seeks the elusive safety of rock, a hologram projected by the dew. Fog is a phantom bred by fire. It is the shape grief assumes, a metaphor for confusion. Fog is a hill in China where poets seek refuge from tyrants. Fog is the reaper that sits on the freeway at night to harvest its victims. A veil the sky casts over the valley to hide the raw wound that we feed on. Fog is the state of the markets. It is the love that I feel for my mother and the hate that clouds the mind of her son. Fog is a tune that you hear on the boardwalk as you experience some mundane fancy of going out with the tide, as Jack London put it. There's no escaping it. Part 2. We flee the city and lose ourselves in its open-air graveyard. Call it Deserbia, a chain of dry valleys, a maze of dirt roads, chicken wire, yucca trees, and piss-yellow don't tread on me flags. It was the final act of the American homesteader. Death plots for the legionnaires of empire. Flatlining hamlets named after lunatic flyboys, mystics, cult leaders, pedophiles, prospectors, and other assorted seekers of extraterrestrials. At dawn, a lone bugle rips through the rare low desert mist. And like the old man said, blow, bugle, blow. And now, as the morning call of the covered wagons dies away, we bring you another story of loss and displacement. This is where I was orphaned, marooned, on Baja's foggy beaches, where my father showed up, broke and bereft, another mad captain spat out by the wrath of the sea. And no matter how many miles I devoured between Tecate and Taos, that fog never left me. I drove down country roads, exploring mining camps, chasing those embers of dead dreams all the way to the ocean. Nothing breaks your heart like a small western town. A few scruffy buildings clustered together, cowed by the might of the land. The devout, frightened believers of a vengeful God. Space, the very space that one day will reclaim them. They sit here, patient, self-sufficient, irrelevant, waiting for that final exodus to put out the lights. At dusk, in a rented hovel, a mile or two out of town, some relief from the heat as the sky turns cobalt, then black, then filthy blue. A thin curl of smoke climbs out of the pit. Critters crawl close to the fire. Snakes slither out of their lairs. And all night long, the bugle call plays on repeat. Perhaps one day I'll stop hearing it. Thank you very much.